Get out of my briefing room. Now. Captain Walker's voice cut through the silence like a blade. He snatched Emily Carter's 14 pages of signal analysis off the table and dropped them on the floor deliberately, slowly making sure every pilot in the room watched them fall. You fix radios, that is all you do. The day a technician tells me how to run a combat mission is the day I turn in my wings. 20 pilots stared. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke up. Emily looked at the papers on the floor. Then she looked at Walker. Her hands were completely steady. She bent down, picked them up, and walked out. 4 days later, those same pilots would owe her their lives. The 56th Fighter Squadron at Edwards Air Force Base ran like a machine that had never once considered the possibility it could break down. 47 personnel, 20 F-16 fighters, one commanding officer who believed with the kind of absolute certainty that only comes from never having been seriously wrong that everything inside that base functioned exactly as it should. Captain James Walker had been decorated 3 times. He had led missions over 2 continents. His photograph hung in the corridor near the main entrance, and whenever a new recruit walked past it on their first day, someone always said the same thing. That is the man you want leading you into the sky. And nobody ever disagreed. Walker was the kind of man who filled every room he walked into. Not because he demanded attention, but because he had been told his entire career that attention was simply his natural due. He shook hands firmly. He made eye contact with purpose. He spoke with the kind of measured confidence that made junior officers write down his words in their notebooks as if they were capturing something that might later be useful. He believed in hierarchy the way some people believe in gravity. It was not something you debated. It was simply the organizing principle of the world. And inside that hierarchy, Emily Carter existed somewhere near the bottom. Not because she was incompetent. Nobody could have honestly said that. Emily Carter arrived before anyone else every single morning, sometimes as early as 4:45 when the base was still dark, and the only sounds were the distant hum of engines being tested in hangars across the field. She sat down at her station inside the communications center, put on her headset, and began her checks with the kind of quiet precision that suggested she had done this same sequence so many times that her hands already knew the steps before her mind did. She maintained 17 separate communication systems. She monitored 6 radio frequencies simultaneously during active operations. She had redesigned the squadron's emergency backup protocol 18 months earlier, after identifying a vulnerability that 3 separate senior technicians had missed, and the only acknowledgement she received was a form memo signed by a junior administrator thanking her for her contribution to operational efficiency. She had taped that memo to the inside of her locker facing inward, where nobody could see it. The pilots knew her the way they knew the coffee machine in the break room. She was always there. She always worked, and they never thought about her until something stopped functioning the way it was supposed to. Lieutenant Marcus Hayes was the one who had started calling her Radio Girl, and the name had spread through the squadron the way all nicknames do, quickly, carelessly, and with the complete absence of malice that somehow makes cruelty more precise. Nobody meant anything by it, which was in its own way the entire problem. Emily never corrected them. She would hear the name from across the room and simply continue what she was doing. Her expression would not change. Her hands would not stop moving. She had a gift for stillness that the people around her mistook for acceptance. It was not acceptance, it was patience. There is a difference, and Emily Carter understood that difference better than almost anyone on that base. She had been living inside that difference for 6 years. On a Tuesday morning in late October, Emily arrived at her station at 4:52 and began her standard frequency sweep. The Nevada Desert Training Corridor, the airspace, the squadron would enter in 4 days for Operation Sandstorm, was already on her monitoring list, and she pulled up the atmospheric data the way a surgeon checks their instruments before committing to the first cut. Carefully, systematically, with her full attention. And then she found something that did not belong there. It was not dramatic. It never is in the beginning. It was simply a pattern that should not have existed inside a routine electromagnetic profile. A cluster of signals at an unusual frequency range appearing and disappearing with a rhythm that was too consistent to be natural interference and too subtle to trigger any automated alert. Emily leaned forward. She ran the sequence twice more. Then she pulled up the historical data for the same corridor going back 90 days. The signal had not been there 3 weeks ago. It had not been there 2 weeks ago. It had appeared 7 days earlier, and since then it had been growing not in volume but in complexity, like something learning its own voice. Emily sat back in her chair. Her stomach felt the way it had felt a long time ago, in a different life when she had been looking at a threat assessment briefing before a combat mission, and something in the numbers had told her that the intelligence was wrong. She had been right then. She was certain she was right now. The question was, what to do with that certainty in a place where nobody considered her certainty worth very much. She requested a meeting with Lieutenant Colonel Patricia Simmons, the base operations coordinator, that same afternoon. She brought printed frequency analyses, comparison charts, and a written summary of her findings, laid out in 7 clean paragraphs with technical references attached. She had been preparing professional documentation since before some of the pilots on that base had finished high school. Simmons looked at the papers for approximately 45 seconds. Emily, we run electromagnetic sweeps through that corridor before every major exercise. Nothing has come up. With respect, ma'am, the standard sweeps wouldn't catch this. The signal is operating at a frequency range outside our normal monitoring parameters. I had to recalibrate my receiver manually to isolate it. You recalibrated outside standard protocol. Emily paused. Yes, ma'am. Simmons put the papers down and folded her hands on her desk. I appreciate your diligence. I'll pass this along to technical review. Emily knew what technical review meant. It meant a folder. It meant a shelf. It meant nothing. Ma'am, with respect, Operation Sandstorm begins in 4 days. If this is what I think it is, what do you think it is, Emily? The question was asked with the kind of gentle patience that adults use with children who have asked the same question too many times. Emily looked at Simmons and felt something tighten in her chest. I think it's a coordinated electronic warfare system, she said. I think someone has positioned hardware inside that corridor specifically to interfere with the squadron's equipment during the exercise. Simmons studied her for a long moment. That would be a significant security incident. Yes, ma'am, it would. And you've based this assessment on a frequency anomaly you found while conducting an unauthorized recalibration. There it was, the framing, the quiet, reasonable repositioning that turned her evidence into a liability and her expertise into a presumption. I can walk you through the technical analysis, ma'am, step by step. Simmons smiled, and the smile was not unkind, and somehow that made it worse. I'll have technical review take a look. In the meantime, please stay within standard protocol parameters. We can't have people making independent adjustments to monitoring equipment without oversight. Emily picked up her papers and walked out of the office. The hallway outside smelled like floor wax and recycled air. She stood there for a moment with her documents pressed flat against her chest and breathed slowly through her nose, the way she had once been taught to breathe when a landing was coming in hard, and she needed her hands completely steady. Then she went back to work, because that was what she always did. The following morning, Emily was already at her station when Captain Walker arrived for the pre-mission briefing. She had been there for 2 hours. In those 2 hours, she had compiled a more detailed analysis of the signal patterns, cross-referenced them against known electronic warfare signatures in unclassified military databases, and developed a preliminary hypothesis about the system's likely operational range and capabilities. She had requested 5 minutes of Walker's time through the administrative office the previous evening. She received a reply at 6 in the morning saying that the captain's schedule was full and she could submit anything she needed to pass along through the standard documentation channel. Emily looked at that message for a long time, then she walked directly to the briefing room. She knew the schedule. She knew Walker would be inside for the next 40 minutes. She also knew that nobody would physically prevent her from walking through that door because she had access clearance to every room in that building, and the worst thing that could happen was that she would be told to leave. She had been told worse things. She pushed open the door. 6 pilots turned to look at her. Walker was standing at the front of the room with a mission map spread across the table. He looked up, and for a moment his expression was simply surprise, the way anyone looks when the expected order of things is briefly interrupted. Then the surprise settled into something harder. Carter, this is a mission briefing. Yes, sir. I apologize for the interruption. I need 5 minutes. You need to submit any communications through the... Captain, I've been trying to reach you through official channels for 36 hours. This cannot wait for documentation channels. She stepped forward and placed her analysis on the table beside his mission map. I've detected an advanced electronic warfare system operating inside the training corridor. These are the frequency signatures. These are my cross-references to known hostile EW profiles. This pattern matches a jamming architecture that was field-tested in Eastern Europe 18 months ago. Well, see, Walker looked at the papers. He looked at them with the eyes of a man who had already decided the conclusion before reviewing the evidence. Our pre-mission sweeps came back clean, he said. Your sweeps wouldn't catch this frequency range. I had to manually... Carter. His voice dropped, and it dropped in a way that filled the room. We have run operations out of this base for 9 years. We have a fully qualified technical team conducting standard sweeps. I have complete confidence in our pre-mission intelligence. Captain, with respect, this particular system is specifically designed to evade standard sweeps. That's the point of it. One of the pilots, Lieutenant Hayes, let out a short breath that was almost a laugh. Not quite, but almost. Walker placed both hands flat on the table. What is your technical classification? Communications specialist grade. Communications specialist. He said it clearly, with deliberate weight. Not intelligence analyst, not systems engineer, communications specialist. He picked up her papers and placed them in a neat stack to the side away from his mission map. I appreciate your concern, but I need you to understand something. He looked directly at her. We have a mission to run. I have pilots to brief. And I need the people in this squadron to stay in their lane and trust that the systems we have in place are adequate for the job. Silence. Now, is there anything else? Emily looked at him, at the pilots around the table, at Lieutenant Hayes, who was studying the ceiling, at the mission map, which showed 20 F-16 flight paths entering the Nevada corridor in 4 days. No, sir, she said. She picked up nothing. She had left her analysis on the table. She did not want it back. Then I think you know where the door is. She walked out. In the hallway, she kept her pace exactly the same. She did not hurry. She did not slow down. She walked to the water fountain at the end of the corridor, pressed the button, drank, and straightened up. Her hands were completely steady. They had been steady in worse moments than this. She walked back to the communications center, sat down at her station, and put on her headset. She had 4 days, and she intended to use every single hour of them. That evening, when the base had gone quiet and the night shift had reduced to a skeleton crew, Emily stayed at her station long after her shift officially ended. The overhead lights had dimmed to their low-power setting, and she worked by the blue-white glow of her monitors, pulling data streams that she had no official reason to be analyzing and running comparisons that nobody had authorized her to run. She did not particularly care about the authorization question at that moment. She cared about the signal. Over the previous 36 hours, it had changed. The pattern was evolving not dramatically, but in the way that a machine evolves when it is being calibrated, when someone is tuning it toward a specific purpose. She had printed each new iteration and laid them side by side across her workspace, and she had been staring at them for the past 20 minutes, with the particular quality of concentration that exists at the border between analysis and instinct. She knew this kind of system, not from textbooks, not from classified briefings, from experience, from flying directly into the teeth of one 7 years ago in a canyon in a country that official records did not acknowledge she had ever been in. She closed her eyes. She could still feel it the moment her navigation went dark, the moment her radio became nothing but noise, the moment the instruments that were supposed to tell her where she was and which direction she was moving suddenly had nothing useful to say. She had been flying at 480 miles per hour through a canyon at night, and every system that was supposed to keep her alive had failed at the same time. She had gotten the aircraft home on instinct, dead reckoning, and 6 years of muscle memory, so deep it had become something closer to reflex than thought. She had gotten it home. The aircraft had never flown again, and neither officially had she. Emily opened her eyes and looked at the signal patterns on her desk. She knew what this was. She knew exactly what it was designed to do. She knew how it activated, how it propagated, how it would reach through 20 cockpits simultaneously and take away every instrument those pilots depended on. She knew because she had felt it from the inside, and the feeling had lived in her body ever since, the way certain things do when they happen to you at high speed with nowhere to go. She picked up her pen. On a clean sheet of paper, she began writing down everything she knew about surviving inside an electronic warfare envelope. Not the technical manual version, not the training simulation version, the real version. The version that nobody writes down because it is not the kind of knowledge that lives in documents. It lives in the hands and the stomach and the part of the brain that fires when everything else goes quiet. She wrote for 3 hours. At 11:47, she heard footsteps in the corridor outside the communications center. They stopped outside the door. There was a knock, not the authoritative knock of someone with authority, but the careful knock of someone who was not entirely sure they were welcome. "Come in," Emily said without looking up. The door opened, and Master Sergeant David Kowalski leaned into the room. He was a broad, unhurried man who had been maintaining aircraft on this base for 22 years, and he moved through the world with the careful deliberateness of someone who had learned that things break when you rush them. He looked at the papers spread across Emily's workspace. He looked at the monitors. He looked at her. "You didn't go home," he said, observant. "I saw your car in the lot when I finished the evening inspection." He stepped fully into the room and closed the door behind him. Kowalski was stitched on the chest of his uniform, but Emily had been calling him Dave for 4 years, ever since the night she had helped him track down an intermittent fault in an F-16's communication array that 3 other technicians had given up on. He pulled a chair from against the wall and sat down across from her without being invited because they were past the point of needing invitations. "Talk to me," he said. Emily put down her pen. She looked at the signal analyses spread across her desk, and then she looked at Kowalski. "I found something in the corridor," she said. "Advanced EW system. Probably ground-based multiple nodes specifically calibrated to hit our operating frequencies." Kowalski was quiet for a moment. "How confident are you?" "Completely." He nodded. He had known Emily long enough to understand what that word meant coming from her. It did not mean probably. It did not mean fairly sure. It meant she had run the numbers until the numbers stopped arguing back. "Walker," he said, "told me to stay in my lane." Kowalski rubbed the back of his neck with one hand. "Simmons, technical review." I was quiet again. Outside, somewhere across the base, an engine fired briefly and then went still. "Dave," Emily said, "those pilots are going to fly into something they don't have any defense against. 20 aircraft, 20 men, and none of them know it's coming because nobody here will listen to the one person who can read it." Kowalski looked at his hands. "What do you need?" he said. Emily looked at him for a long moment. She had a great deal of respect for David Kowalski, not because he was easy, but because he was honest. Because in 22 years of maintaining aircraft on military bases, he had never learned to pretend that a problem did not exist simply because acknowledging it was inconvenient. "Right now," she said, "I need you to keep this between us, and I need you to think about what's in Hangar 7. Kowalski went very still. Hangar 7 sat at the edge of the base property, away from the primary maintenance facilities in a part of the compound that most personnel had no reason to visit. It was not classified. It was simply old. It contained equipment that was no longer in active rotation, materials that were awaiting processing in a single F-16D that had been sitting in the back corner for 2 years, officially logged as awaiting final disposition review. Emily had been maintaining it. Not officially, not in any log or record, but for 24 months every time she had extra time after completing her standard duties. She had walked to Hangar 7 and she had spent 45 minutes checking systems, keeping components from ceasing running, partial diagnostics with equipment she carried in a bag that she kept locked in the bottom drawer of her workstation. Kowalski knew she went there. He had known for 18 months. He had never asked her about it, and she had never explained it. And between them, it had existed as the kind of shared understanding that does not require words, because it is built on something more solid than conversation. He looked at her now with the careful expression of a man who was measuring the distance between what was officially possible and what was actually necessary. "How long?" he said. "Meaning the aircraft. Meaning how long to make it flight-worthy." Emily did not hesitate. 24 hours of proper work. If we start tonight, we're ready before the mission." Kowalski stood up. He picked up his jacket from the back of the chair. He put it on one arm at a time slowly with the unhurried deliberateness that was simply who he was. "Show me the signal data," he said. "All of it." Emily turned her monitors toward him, and for the next 2 hours, in the quiet blue light of the communications center, she walked him through everything she had found. He asked questions that were precise and specific and demonstrated a depth of technical understanding that most people would not have associated with a man whose official job was aircraft maintenance. Kowalski had been fixing things for 22 years, and fixing things meant understanding them. And understanding them meant that sometimes you knew things that were not written in any job description. At 1:43 in the morning, he looked up from the frequency charts and said, "This is real." "Yes," Emily said, "and you're right about what it does." "I know." He was quiet for a moment. "Emily." He said her name carefully, the way he always did when he was about to say something he had thought about. "If you're wrong, I'm not wrong." "I know you're not wrong," he paused. "But if something goes wrong with the aircraft, with the mission, with any of it, you know what they'll do. You know how this ends for you if anything goes sideways." Emily looked at him steadily. "I know. And you're still sitting here at 1 in the morning, running unauthorized diagnostics on a signal that nobody else believes exists. And you're thinking about taking up an aircraft that nobody has cleared for flight, and you're—" He stopped. He rubbed his jaw. "You're doing this anyway." "Dave," her voice was quiet and even and absolutely certain. 20 men. Kowalski looked at the ceiling for a moment. Then he looked at her. "All right," he said, "let's go look at that aircraft." They walked through the base in the middle of the night, side by side, saying nothing. The air was cold, and the sky above them was the kind of clear that only exists in desert places where there is nothing between you and the stars but distance. Hangar 7 was dark when they arrived. Emily punched in the access code. She had memorized it years ago, and nobody had ever thought to revoke her clearance. And the heavy door rolled open slowly, the mechanical sound of it enormous in the desert quiet. She reached inside and found the light switch. The overhead lights came on in sequence, flickering once before settling, and the hangar filled with a steady yellow-white light that showed everything inside it in the particular clarity of a space that was familiar and still. The F-16 was in the back corner, exactly where it had always been. Silver and gray and still, with the particular stillness of something that has been waiting. Kowalski walked toward it slowly. He put his hand on the nose and looked up the fuselage the way a person looks at something they have known a long time. "Still looks good," he said. "I kept it good," Emily said. He turned and looked at her. She was standing a few feet away, and in the yellow light of the hangar, she looked exactly like what she was, a woman who had spent 6 years quietly making herself invisible, standing in front of the one thing in her life that had always known exactly who she was. "You've been ready for this," he said. It was not a question. Emily looked at the aircraft. She looked at it the way you look at something that once saved your life, and that you have spent years trying to decide whether you owed it anything in return. "I've been ready," she said, "since the day I stopped flying." The night was long, and the work was harder than either of them made it look. But Kowalski was the kind of man who had 22 years of making things work under exactly the kind of conditions where things should not have worked. And Emily was the kind of woman who had been waiting 6 years for a reason to stop waiting. By 4 in the morning, they had completed the first phase of inspection. By 7, the hydraulic systems had been verified and the electrical connections tested. By the time the rest of the base was waking up, and the pilots of the 56th Fighter Squadron were eating breakfast and discussing Operation Sandstorm with the comfortable confidence of men who believed they knew everything they needed to know, Emily Carter was back at her communications station, headset in place, eyes on her monitors, looking for all the world, like exactly what everyone on the base believed her to be. A radio technician sitting quietly in the background, going unnoticed, just as she always had. But something had changed, not in the base, not in the squadron, not in the hierarchy that Walker maintained with such absolute conviction. Something had changed in Emily Carter, not in the way that things change when a person makes a decision, in the way that things change when a person stops pretending that the decision hasn't already been made. She pressed her headset tighter against her ear and listened to the frequencies coming out of the Nevada desert, and in the particular silence between one signal and the next, she could feel something that she had not allowed herself to feel in 6 years. The anticipation of flight, the knowledge that the sky was waiting, and the absolute bone-deep certainty that when the moment came when 20 pilots flew into a trap that nobody had believed her about, she would be ready. She had always been ready. The world had simply not known it yet. 3 days before Operation Sandstorm, Emily Carter had not slept more than 4 hours in any single night. Not because she could not sleep, because she would not allow herself to. She had a system. She had always had a system. When the world stopped listening, you stopped asking for permission, and you started working. You built the case so airtight that eventually the evidence would speak for itself even if the people around you refused to. And if the evidence was not enough, then you made yourself into the solution. That was what she was doing. At 6:37 in the morning, while the pilots of the 56 were running their pre-mission physical conditioning drills on the far side of the base, Emily was at her station with 3 monitors running simultaneously. The left screen showed the live frequency sweep of the Nevada corridor. The center screen showed her comparative analysis, now spanning 9 days of signal data. The right screen showed declassified technical documentation. She had spent the previous night pulling from military research archives documentation on electronic warfare system architectures that had been developed and field-tested over the past decade. She was not supposed to have access to the full archive. Technically, her clearance covered operational communication systems and frequency monitoring. Technically, pulling research documents on advanced EW architectures was outside her authorized scope. Emily had never been particularly patient with technical restrictions when lives were at stake. She found the reference she was looking for at 6:51. It was buried inside a 2019 technical analysis paper from a defense research group that had been studying adversarial electronic warfare capabilities. The paper described a system theoretical at the time of writing, but with specific engineering parameters laid out in the appendices that operated on exactly the frequency signature she had been tracking. The paper called it a distributed suppression architecture. It was designed to be installed in multiple ground-based nodes across a wide area, with each node broadcasting at a power level low enough to evade standard detection sweeps. Individually, the nodes were invisible, but when they activated simultaneously, they created an overlapping electromagnetic envelope that would hit every aircraft in a defined airspace at once, targeting navigation, communication, and warning systems with a precision that a single powerful jammer could not achieve. Emily read the technical specifications 3 times. Then she read the field deployment section, and she stopped breathing for approximately 4 seconds, because the paper noted that this system had been considered experimental as of 2019, but concluded with a section on projected operational timelines. The projected timeline for full operational deployment by potential adversarial actors was listed as 22 to 30 months from the date of publication. She did the math without a calculator. The paper was dated March 2019. 30 months from March 2019 was September 2021. It was now October 23, which meant this system had been operationally viable for over 2 years. Emily set down her pen. She looked at the frequency data on her left screen, then at the technical documentation on her right, and then she did something she had not done in front of anyone at this base in 6 years. She allowed herself for exactly 3 seconds to look afraid. Not panicked, not uncertain, just the clean, clear-eyed fear of someone who has just understood the full size of the problem they are looking at. Then she picked up her pen again. She wrote one line at the top of a fresh page. This is not a training exercise anymore. Then she got back to work. At 8:15, Kowalski appeared in the doorway of the communications center. He was carrying 2 cups of coffee and wearing the expression of a man who had also not slept enough. He crossed the room, set 1 cup on the edge of her workspace without a word, and looked at the 3 monitors. "Find anything new," he said. "Sit down," Emily said. He sat. She walked him through the research paper. She showed him the frequency correlations. She showed him the deployment timeline. She watched his face change as the pieces connected, not dramatically, not with the sudden theatrical shock of someone discovering something unexpected, but with the slow, settling recognition of someone who had spent 22 years fixing machines and knew what it looked like when multiple failing components pointed toward a single source. When she finished, Kowalski was quiet for a long moment. "This isn't domestic," he said. "No. Someone brought this hardware in from outside, set it up in the corridor specifically for this exercise." "Yes, which means someone knew about Operation Sandstorm in advance. Someone with access to the mission schedule." Emily looked at him. He looked back at her. "That's a very large problem," he said. "I know. Emily, that's not just an EW system in a training corridor. That's a breach. Someone inside, or someone with access to someone inside." Kowalski set down his coffee. He rubbed his face with both hands the way people do when they are trying to organize thoughts that are coming faster than they can process them. You need to take this to Walker again. Walker told me to stay in my lane. This is bigger than Walker. I know that. Walker doesn't. Kowalski looked at her steadily. You could go over his head. Colonel Harrington is 3 time zones away at a joint command conference and doesn't return until the day of the mission. Emily had checked. She had checked everything. The chain of command inside this base runs through Walker for anything mission-related, and Walker has already decided I don't have anything worth hearing. She paused. I've been doing the math, Dave. Every official route I have runs through people who have already told me no. I have 3 days. So what do you do? Emily looked at her monitors. I keep working, she said. I build the most complete picture I can of what this system is going to do when it activates. And I make sure that when the moment comes, I'm the person with the clearest understanding of how to get 20 aircraft safely out of it. Kowalski was quiet. How's the aircraft, she said. I put 2 more hours into it last night after you left. He said it with the matter-of-fact tone of someone reporting routine maintenance, and they both understood that there was nothing routine about it. Flight systems are nominal. I need another full day on the engine diagnostic, and the secondary comm array needs a component swap, but I can have that sourced by tonight. Where are you sourcing the component? Don't ask me that. Emily looked at him. Don't ask me that, he said again without apology. You need the aircraft ready. I'll make it ready. Ready. That's the part of this that I'm handling. She nodded once. He picked up his coffee, stood up, and paused at the edge of her workspace. He looked at the lines she had written at the top of the fresh page. This is not a training exercise anymore. He did not say anything. He walked out. Emily turned back to her monitors and kept working. By noon, she had completed a full operational profile of the EW system she believed was waiting in that corridor. She had mapped its probable node positions based on the terrain data, and the signal direction analysis estimated its effective radius, calculated the most likely activation sequence, and identified 3 things that the research paper had described as the system's primary vulnerabilities. The vulnerabilities were narrow. They required specific knowledge of the system's architecture to exploit. They were not the kind of thing a pilot who had just lost all his instruments at altitude was going to figure out under pressure. But they were there, and Emily knew exactly what to do with them. At 2 in the afternoon, she made one more attempt through official channels. She was calm about it. She had learned long ago that being calm in moments of urgency was not passivity. It was strategy. Anger closed doors. Composure kept them open long enough to find the one that would eventually work. She went to the intelligence office and asked to speak with Captain Howard, the base intelligence officer. Howard was not Walker. Howard was a different kind of officer. Careful, methodical, with the particular professional caution of someone who had learned to take information seriously regardless of its source. He listened. He listened for 20 minutes, which was longer than anyone else on this base had given her, and Emily used every one of those minutes with the precision of someone who knew exactly how much time they had and exactly what they needed to accomplish inside it. When she finished, Howard leaned back in his chair and looked at the ceiling. I believe your technical analysis is sound, he said. Emily's breath caught. She kept her expression neutral. But my authority here is limited, Howard continued. Mission planning and operational decisions are Walker's domain. I can flag this as a point of concern in the intelligence summary, but I can't override a mission commander's judgment on his own operation. Captain Howard, she kept her voice even, if I'm right about what this system does, if you're right, then Walker is flying 20 aircraft into a situation they're not prepared for. He paused. I understand what you're saying, Carter. But you're asking me to go to Walker with an intelligence flag based on a frequency analysis that his own technical team hasn't confirmed sourced from a communications specialist operating outside her authorized parameters. He paused again. You understand how that reads. I understand exactly how it reads, Emily said. I also understand what happens to 20 pilots when their navigation, communication, and warning systems fail simultaneously at altitude. Howard looked at her. Something moved in his expression, not sympathy exactly, but the particular discomfort of a person who knows that they are sitting inside a gap between what they should do and what they are allowed to do. I'll include it in the summary, he said. That's the most I can do. Thank you, Emily said. She meant it. An intelligence flag was not nothing. It was a data point in the record. It was a document that said she had been right when the time came for someone to look back and figure out how things had gone wrong. She hoped with everything she had that nobody would ever need to look at that record. She walked out of the intelligence office and straight into Captain Walker. Not figuratively, literally. She turned out of Howard's door and Walker was 3 steps away in the corridor, moving in the opposite direction, and they almost collided, and for one fraction of a second, they were standing 18 inches apart and looking directly at each other. Walker recovered first. Carter, his voice was flat. Captain, were you just in with Howard? There was no point in anything other than honesty. Yes, sir. Something shifted in Walker's face. Not quite anger, something more controlled than anger. The cold, efficient displeasure of a man who had been disobeyed in a way that was technically within the rules. I thought I made myself clear, he said. You made yourself clear about the briefing room, sir. Captain Howard is a separate chain. Howard is part of my mission support structure. Captain Howard is the base intelligence officer. His function exists independently of specific mission command. She said it quietly without challenge in her voice. Pure information. I wasn't trying to go around you, Captain. I was trying to make sure the information was documented. Walker studied her for a moment. He was not a stupid man. She had never thought he was a stupid man. He was a man who had organized his certainty around a particular way of understanding the world. And the problem was not his intelligence. It was that his certainty had become a closed system. Let me ask you something, he said. His voice had gone to a register she had not heard from him before. Quieter, harder. How long have you been stationed here? 6 years, sir. 6 years. He nodded slowly. And in 6 years, have we ever had a mission fail due to a communication or EW issue that your department didn't anticipate? Emily was quiet for a moment. No, sir. No. He spread his hands briefly, a small gesture that encompassed everything. That's because the systems we have in place work. The protocols we follow work. The chain of command works. He looked at her with something that might have been underneath everything else, a genuine attempt to be reasonable. I'm not dismissing you because I think you're incompetent. I'm asking you to trust the process because the process exists for a reason. Captain, Emily chose her words with care. The process was designed for known threats. What I'm telling you is that there may be an unknown threat inside that corridor, one specifically architected to exploit the gaps in our standard protocols. Not because our protocols are bad, because someone designed this system to go around them. She paused. I'm not asking you to trust me over the process. I'm asking you to consider that the process might not be sufficient for what's in that corridor. Walker looked at her for a long time. We fly in 3 days, he said. The mission has been planned for 4 months. 20 pilots are trained and prepared. Our intelligence shows a clean corridor. He straightened his posture slightly, a small, unconscious movement that meant the conversation was over. I understand you feel strongly about this, Carter, but I need you to let us do our job. He walked past her. Emily stood in the corridor and listened to his footsteps recede. Then she walked back to the communications center. She sat down at her station. She pulled up the live frequency feed from the Nevada corridor. The signal was still there. It was stronger, not dramatically, measurably stronger. The kind of increase that would not trigger any automated alert, but that was unmistakable when you were looking at the right frequency range with the right equipment and you knew exactly what you were looking for. Emily stared at the data. Something was being calibrated. She pressed her palm flat against the desk and felt the cold surface of it against her skin, grounding real. She had felt this specific sensation before, this particular combination of certainty and powerlessness, of knowing exactly what was coming and being unable to make the people around you understand it in time. She had felt it in a cockpit a long time ago. She had felt it in the seconds before everything went wrong. She was not going to sit still and feel it again. She picked up the phone on her desk. She did not call anyone at the base. She called a number she had memorized 11 months earlier and never used because memorizing it had felt like something between preparation and confession, an acknowledgement that there might come a day when she would need something that no longer officially existed. It rang 3 times. Mercer, said the voice on the other end. Colonel Patricia Mercer, retired, former director of electronic warfare training, United States Air Force, the woman who had once signed Emily Carter's first combat deployment papers and who had 6 years later signed the separation documents that ended her flying career. One of the 4 people alive who knew the full story of who Emily Carter actually was. Patricia, Emily said. A pause. Not surprise, Mercer was not easily surprised. Something more like the settling of a person who had been waiting for a call they expected would eventually come. Emily, what she said. It's been a while. I need technical consultation. Emily's voice was level. Not official, just your knowledge. Tell me. Emily told her. She laid out the signal data, the frequency analysis, the research paper, the correlation with the EW system architecture, the timeline, the deployment parameters. She talked for 11 minutes without stopping, and Mercer listened without interrupting, which was the thing Emily had always respected most about her. When Emily stopped, Mercer was quiet for several seconds. You're describing a DISA configuration, Mercer said. Distributed electronic suppression architecture. The last confirmed deployment of a system like that was in the Baltic Exercise 2021. That matches the timeline in the research paper. Emily, Mercer's voice shifted. If you're right about the node configuration and the activation radius, that system will take down every aircraft in the corridor simultaneously. Navigation, primary comm warning systems, threat identification. All of it. I know. And these pilots have no training for flying blind in a confined airspace with 20 aircraft at close intervals. I know that too. Another pause. Have you told Walker? 3 times, different channels. Mercer made a sound that was not quite a word. It was the sound of someone absorbing something they had hoped would have a different answer. Do you want me to make some calls? Emily thought about it. Not yet, she said. If you start making calls from the outside, Walker gets defensive, and the whole thing becomes political, and nothing happens faster. I have 3 days. Let me work the problem from here first. She paused. But I need to know the vulnerabilities in a DISA system. The research paper identified 3. Do you know of any others? Mercer was quiet for a moment in the way that means someone is deciding how much to say. There's a 4th, she said. It's not in any published paper because it was identified in a classified field evaluation and never released. The system has a synchronization window about 12 seconds during initial activation before the nodes fully phase lock. During that window, the suppression isn't complete. A pilot who knows the window is coming can maintain partial navigation function if they're in the right mode at the right moment. Emily wrote it down. What mode? Mercer told her. Emily wrote that down too. Emily. Mercer's voice carried the weight of someone who was about to say something they had been holding for a long time. Are you flying again? Emily looked at the piece of paper in front of her. I don't know yet, she said. That's a yes. Emily said nothing. You were the best I ever put in that cockpit, Mercer said. I want you to know I never stopped believing that. Not after the injury, not after the separation, not for one day. Emily's jaw tightened slightly. She breathed through it. Thank you for the information, she said. Be careful, Mercer said. And Emily, whatever happens, you were always a pilot. A piece of paper never changed that. The call ended. Emily sat with the phone in her hand for a moment before setting it down. She was not going to think about what Mercer had said. Not right now. Now was not the time for the feelings that those words wanted to open. There would be time for that later when 20 men were safely on the ground and the corridor was clear, and she could afford to sit with the full weight of 6 years in a single breath. Right now, she had a 4th vulnerability. She opened her notebook and added it to her operational profile. Then she went back to the frequency data and ran a new calculation, this time looking for evidence of the synchronization pattern that would indicate when the nodes were being calibrated toward their final phase lock sequence. She found it at 4:47 in the afternoon. It was small. It would have meant nothing to anyone who didn't know what to look for. But it was there, a micro-oscillation in the carrier wave that indicated the nodes were running synchronization tests. They were getting ready. Emily looked at the data for a long time. Then she picked up her phone and texted Kowalski 3 words. Tonight. Hangar 7. His reply came back in under a minute. Already here. She almost smiled. At 5:15, she was still at her station when Lieutenant Hayes walked through the communications center on his way to the equipment storage room at the back. He was moving quickly with the loose physical confidence of someone who had spent the day doing something that required his body more than his mind, and he nearly walked past her without pausing. He paused. Not because he planned to. She could see it on his face, a small, involuntary hesitation. He looked at her station, at the 3 screens, at the pages of handwritten notes and printed frequency charts spread across her workspace. Still at it, he said. His tone was not unkind. That was the thing about Hayes. He was not a cruel person. He had called her radio girl without thinking about it, not because he wanted to diminish her, but because he had never been asked to think about her at all. Yes, she said. He stood there for a moment in the way people stand when they have stopped without a destination and are not sure whether to continue or commit to the pause. He looked at the screens again. What is all of that? He said. Emily looked at him. She looked at the papers and then back at him. And she made a decision, not a large one, not a dramatic one, but the kind of small, specific decision that sometimes matters as much as the large ones. Sit down, she said. He sat. She walked him through it, not the full technical analysis. She did not have that much faith in the available time or his background. But she showed him the signal data, the pattern, the timeline. She explained what a DISA system was in plain language without jargon, the way she had once explained complex avionics systems to new recruits in a life that this base did not know she had lived. Hayes listened. His expression changed in increments from polite attention to genuine focus to something that was close to discomfort. So you're saying something in that corridor is going to take out our instruments, he said when she was done, simultaneously across all 20 aircraft. During the exercise. Yes. Hayes was quiet for a moment. He looked at his hands. He had large hands, pilot's hands, strong and precise. He looked at them like they had just become a more complicated thing. And Walker knows about this. Walker has heard about this 3 times in 3 different formats through 3 different channels. Hayes absorbed that. He didn't believe you, he said. He believes the pre-mission sweeps. He doesn't believe the sweeps missed something. Did they? Emily looked at him steadily. Yes. Hayes ran his hand over the back of his neck. He looked at the screens for a long moment. Okay, he said. He said it quietly, more to himself than to her. Like a man who has just shifted the weight he's been carrying from one side to the other and is figuring out what to do with it now. Okay, is there any way to verify this? Something I could take to Walker that would... I've tried everything I have access to verify it, Emily said. What I have is what you've seen, which he doesn't believe. Which he doesn't believe. Hayes sat there for another moment. Then he stood up. He looked down at her workspace, at the pages of handwritten analysis, at the 3 monitors, at the systematic, exhaustive work of someone who had been taking this seriously since before anyone else knew there was something to take seriously. I believe you, he said. Emily looked up at him. It was not a grand statement. He said it the way a person says a simple fact directly without performance. But something about the plainness of it made it land harder than anything more dramatic would have. Thank you, she said. What do I do with that? He said. Not sarcastically, genuinely. Get some sleep, she said. And when you're in that cockpit in 3 days, if something goes wrong with your instruments, listen for my voice. I'll be on the frequency. He nodded. He started toward the back of the room. Hayes, she said. He stopped. Don't tell Walker you talked to me. She paused. Not yet. It'll make it worse. He thought about that. Yeah, he said. Okay. And he walked out. Emily watched him go. Then she turned back to her monitors. She had 2 days and 14 hours. She was going to use every minute of them. At 10:45 that night, she locked down her station, pulled on her jacket, and walked out of the communications center into the cold night air. She moved through the base with the deliberate casualness of a person who belonged exactly where they were, which she did, because she had every legitimate reason to be on these grounds. And the fact that her destination was Hangar 7 at 11 o'clock at night was simply something that the night itself did not need to know about. Kowalski was inside when she arrived. He was not alone. Standing beside the F-16D, wearing civilian clothes and looking slightly out of place in the hangar, was a man she had not seen in 4 years. Compact, gray-haired, with the kind of calm that comes from spending a career in situations where calm is not optional. Senior Airman Torres, retired 6 months ago. One of the best avionics specialists she had ever worked beside. Emily stopped in the doorway. Dave, she said. You need a second person on the avionics, Kowalski said without looking up from what he was working on. Torres doesn't work here anymore. He doesn't officially exist tonight. He's just a guy who likes to look at old airplanes. Torres raised one hand in a small wave. Emily walked across the hangar to where he was standing and looked at the aircraft. You heard, she said. Dave called me this afternoon, Torres said. Told me enough. He looked at the F-16D. I know this bird. Worked her for 2 years before she got stood down. He looked at Emily. She's in better shape than she should be. I've been maintaining her. He nodded. He looked at her with the level-assessing look of a man who had worked around pilots his entire career and knew what they looked like in the moments before something important. You sure about this? Emily looked at the aircraft. She thought about the signal data on her left screen growing stronger each day. She thought about 20 flight paths crossing a corridor that was waiting for them like a trap. She thought about Lieutenant Mitchell, the youngest pilot in the squadron, 24 years old and only his second major exercise, who flew with the kind of instinctive skill that reminded her of herself at that age, and who did not yet know enough to know what he did not know. She thought about Colonel Mercer's voice on the phone. You were always a pilot. Yes, she said. Torres nodded. He picked up a diagnostic panel. Then let's get to work, he said. They worked through the night. The three of them. No authorization, no official sanction, working on an aircraft that officially did not exist in the operational inventory, preparing for a contingency that officially did not exist in the mission plan, driven by the specific, quiet urgency of people who have looked at the full picture and accepted responsibility for what they see. At 3:27 in the morning, Torres ran the final avionics check and called out each system in sequence. Navigation, communication, threat identification, engine management, flight controls, backup systems, nominal, 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 nominal. Emily stood beside the cockpit with her hand resting lightly on the edge of the canopy frame. The metal was cold under her palm, real and specific and present. She's ready, Torres said. Emily did not move for a moment. Emily, Kowalski said quietly. She looked at him. You know, this is the most reckless thing you've ever done, he said. It's the most necessary thing I've ever done. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded once with the particular gravity of a man who has decided which side of a difficult choice he stands on. Then we're with you, he said. Torres raised one hand briefly in agreement. It was not a dramatic gesture. It was a simple, honest thing, the kind of solidarity that does not require a speech. Emily looked at the aircraft one more time. The signal in the corridor was getting stronger. 2 days. She was ready. The morning of Operation Sandstorm arrived, the way all significant mornings do, quietly without ceremony, with no indication in the air itself that anything was different from any other day. Emily was already at her station at 4:15. She had not slept. She had gone back to her quarters at 2 in the morning, lain on her bunk fully clothed, stared at the ceiling for 40 minutes, and then gotten up and walked back to the communications center because lying still had become physically impossible. She checked the corridor signal at 4:17. It had spiked overnight, not a gradual increase, a step change of the kind that happens when a system moves from calibration mode into standby activation. The nodes were no longer testing their synchronization. They were holding it, waiting. She sat with that information for a moment. Then she opened the frequency monitoring log and documented everything with timestamps the way she always did, with the particular discipline of someone who understood that documentation was not just record keeping. It was proof. It was the written record of what you knew and when you knew it. And in the world she was operating in right now, proof was the only currency that would matter when this was over. At 5:45, she heard the pilots gathering in the corridor outside the briefing room. She could identify most of them by the sound of their footsteps. By now, Walker's deliberate, even pace, Hayes's quicker stride, Mitchell's lighter step that always seemed slightly ahead of the rhythm of the group, as if his body was perpetually in a hurry to get to the next thing. She heard Mitchell's voice through the wall, saying something that made 2 other pilots laugh, young, easy laughter, the kind that belongs to people who have not yet been badly frightened. Emily closed her eyes for 1 second, then she opened them and kept working. At 6:30, Kowalski appeared in the doorway. He looked like a man who had slept 3 hours, which was probably accurate. How's the signal? He said. Standby activation, Emily said. They're waiting for the aircraft. Kowalski absorbed that. We're ready on our end, he said. Torres ran a final check at 5, everything nominal. Emily nodded. Emily. He said her name with the specific weight of someone about to say something that needed saying. Once they launch, you have a very small window. You know that. I know. If you take that aircraft up without authorization during an active mission, I know Dave. They could ground you permanently. They could. Dave. She turned and looked at him directly. If I don't take that aircraft up and something happens to those pilots that I could have prevented, then it doesn't matter what they do to me afterward. You understand? He was quiet for a long moment. Yeah, he said. I understand. Go to Hangar 7, stay by the aircraft. When I call you, I need it ready inside 10 minutes. He nodded once and left. Emily turned back to her monitors. At 7:58, the first F-16 engine fired on the flight line. The sound of it moved through the walls of the communications center and into her chest. It was not something you heard so much as felt a deep physical signature that belonged to a specific machine, and Emily's body knew it the way it knows the rhythm of its own heartbeat. She had sat in the source of that sound. She had felt it beneath her and around her and transmitted up through the seat into her spine. She pressed her head set tighter against her ears and focused. At 8:10, Walker's voice came over the primary mission frequency. Clear controlled the voice of a man who was completely certain about what the next several hours would look like. All aircraft, this is Sandstorm lead. We are go for departure. Maintain formation through initial ascent. Entry to primary corridor at 08:45. Let's do this clean. Acknowledgements came back from the squadron, 20 voices in sequence, each one confident and ready. Emily listened to all 20. Then she began recording. She had set up a secondary monitoring protocol overnight, a system that would give her simultaneous tracking of all 20 aircraft transponder signals overlaid on her frequency map of the corridor. It was not standard equipment configuration. She had built it herself from components that were technically in her maintenance inventory, using software modifications she had written in the early hours of the morning. If the EW system activated, she would see it on this display at the same moment the pilots felt it in their cockpits, and she would already be on the frequency. The minutes moved with the particular compressed intensity of time passing near something important. 8:22. The formation reached cruising altitude. 8:31. They crossed the outer boundary of the Nevada training zone. 8:41. Walker called corridor entry. All 20 aircraft acknowledged. Emily's eyes were on the secondary monitor. 8:43. Nothing. 8:44. Nothing. 8:45. She saw it before she heard anything from the pilots. The frequency map lit up like something had thrown a switch. The signal did not increase. Gradually, it went from standby to full activation in under 2 seconds, the nodes phase locking exactly as the research paper had described, generating an overlapping electromagnetic envelope across the entire corridor simultaneously. Emily was already reaching for the transmit key. She was already opening her mouth. And then Walker's voice came over the mission frequency, and for the first time in the entire operation, it did not sound controlled. All aircraft, I'm showing navigation failure. Check your systems. Then haze sharper, faster, comms are degrading. I'm getting interference across all primary channels. Then 3 voices at once overlapping, and underneath them, a quality of disorientation that Emily recognized the way you recognize the voice of someone you know in a crowd. It was the sound of 20 trained, skilled pilots discovering simultaneously that the instruments they depended on had stopped telling the truth. Emily pressed the transmit key. All aircraft, all aircraft. Her voice went to a register she had not used in 6 years. Not precisely the opposite, calm, focused, carrying the specific authority of absolute competence. This is Valkyrie. Confirm you are experiencing simultaneous instrument failure across navigation and primary communication systems. Dead air for 2 seconds. Then Walker. Who is this? Identify yourself. Captain Walker, this is Emily Carter. Communications Center Edwards. I need you to listen to me right now. She kept her voice even. There was no time for anything other than precise, essential information. You have entered an active electronic suppression zone, DESA configuration. All 20 aircraft are affected simultaneously. Navigation and warning systems are compromised. You are not receiving accurate position data. Another silence. In that silence, Emily could hear the texture of what was happening. The squelch and distortion of signals, fighting against interference, the fragmented quality of communication systems, trying to function inside something that was designed to prevent them from functioning. Then Walker again, and his voice had changed. It had not broken. Walker was not a man whose voice broke easily, but it had shifted from command authority to something that was working very hard to maintain command authority, which is a different thing. Carter, our sweeps showed a clean corridor. The sweeps didn't cover the right frequency range. Captain, I don't have time to explain the technical analysis. I need you to trust me right now and do exactly what I say. Another pause. It lasted 4 seconds. Emily counted them. "Talk," Walker said. And Emily Carter, communications specialist radio technician, the woman nobody noticed, took control of 20 F-16 fighters in active distress and began bringing them home. All aircraft switch primary navigation to backup INS mode immediately. Do not attempt to use GPS. The system is being fed corrupted data. INS is not affected by this suppression architecture. Acknowledged by call sign. One by one, the acknowledgments came. Some were clean, some were fragmented by interference, but they came. All 20. Good. Listen carefully. The suppression system has a partial vulnerability during the first 12 seconds of full activation. That window is closing, but you may still have residual navigation function in INS mode. I need every aircraft to execute a simultaneous heading change to 270 due west in exactly 15 seconds from my mark. This will move the formation toward the edge of the suppression radius. Do not deviate. Do not change altitude until I tell you. Mark in 1098. She kept counting. She kept her voice absolutely steady. She had done this before. Not from a communication center. From a cockpit in the dark in a canyon she was not supposed to be in, with every instrument she had telling her things that were not true. She had done it from the inside, which meant she understood every single thing those pilots were feeling right now, and she understood it not as a theory or a simulation, but as a physical memory living in her hands and her stomach and the back of her throat. Mark, execute heading change now. For 3 seconds, Emily could not hear anything over the interference. Then Hayes came through, his voice tight but holding, executing, all aircraft comply. Emily let out one breath. 1. Then she was back. Good. Maintain heading 270. I'm monitoring your transponder signals from here. You are moving toward the edge of the active suppression zone. Your INS should begin showing more stable readings in approximately 90 seconds. She paused. Captain Walker, I need a status report. What systems are you showing as operational? Walker's response came through with less interference than before, a small measurable improvement that meant the heading change was working. INS is stable. Primary comm is intermittent. Warning systems are down. A beat. Carter, how did you know the heading? I mapped the suppression radius before the mission, Emily said. I've been tracking the system for 4 days. Silence. Then Hayes in his voice carried something that was not quite irony and not quite awe. She told us 4 days ago. Nobody responded to that. Emily did not have time to let it land. Because at that moment, her secondary monitor showed something she had not anticipated. One transponder signal had separated from the formation, Aircraft 17 Mitchell. She pulled up the individual transponder data with the speed of someone who knows exactly which keys to press. Mitchell's aircraft had executed the heading change, but the track was wrong. It was not moving cleanly west with the formation. It was drifting, a slow, continuous drift to the south that was small enough to be invisible to someone flying by instruments, and catastrophic if it continued for another 4 minutes, because it would put him directly into a mountain ridge that was not currently showing on his navigation display, because his navigation display was still compromised. Emily felt something cold move through her. Mitchell, she said, this is Valkyrie. Call your status. Static. Aircraft 17, Lieutenant Mitchell, call your status now. More static, and then underneath it, Mitchell's voice, young, working hard to stay level and not quite making it. Valkyrie, I'm reading drift on my ANS. Something's wrong with the gyro. I can't confirm my heading. Gyro malfunction. On top of the EW suppression. Emily's hands moved before she finished processing the thought. She was already pulling the terrain data, already calculating his rate of drift against the ridge coordinates, already doing the math that told her he had 3 minutes and 40 seconds before his situation became unrecoverable without outside help. Mitchell, listen to my voice. Only my voice. Ignore everything else. She kept her voice the same level, certain the specific quality of calm that is not the absence of urgency, but its most concentrated form. Your gyro is giving you bad data. I need you to fly by feel. You know how to do that. You were trained for it. Valkyrie, I can't see the ridge. You don't need to see it. I can see it for you. That's my job right now. Your job is to trust your hands and do exactly what I tell you. She watched the transponder track on her screen. You are currently drifting 4 degrees south of your intended heading. I need you to come right, not hard, gently. Come right 3 degrees and hold. Do it now. She watched the transponder track. For 2 seconds, it continued its drift. Then it corrected. Emily exhaled. Good. That's exactly right. Hold that heading. She watched the track stabilize. How's your altitude? Holding at 18,000. Altimeter seems okay. Your altimeter is not affected by the suppression. Trust your altimeter. Do not change altitude without my instruction. She kept her eyes on his track. It was holding. The ridge was clearing to his south. You're doing well, Mitchell. 3 minutes and you're clear of the suppression zone. Walker came back on the frequency. The interference was noticeably less. Now the formation was reaching the edge of the active radius. Carter. His voice had something new in it. Not quite humility. Something adjacent to it. Something that a proud man produces when he is being honest in a moment that does not leave room for anything other than honesty. What's your read on the formation? 14 aircraft are clear of the active suppression zone or approaching the boundary. Your systems should begin restoring in 60 to 90 seconds. She kept watching Mitchell's track. 5 aircraft in the trailing group still have degraded navigation. I'll walk them out individually if needed. Mitchell has a secondary gyro issue. I have him under direct guidance. Copy that. A pause. Carter the Ridge. What's his clearance? He had pulled up his own terrain data. He was checking her work. She almost said something about that, and then she decided that this was not the moment. At current heading and speed, he clears the ridge by 1,100 feet, she said, which is comfortable, but I want him another degree right before we celebrate anything. Mitchell, Walker said, you heard Valkyrie. Come right 1 additional degree. Mitchell, copy. Coming right. Emily watched the track. It was good. It was clean. She kept watching. The next 4 minutes were the longest 4 minutes of Emily Carter's professional life, and she had lived through some long minutes. She guided the 5 trailing aircraft out of the suppression zone one at a time, calling headings, confirming transponder positions, managing the coordination between pilots, who were flying by her voice because their instruments had failed them in the exact way she had predicted they would. She kept her own voice the same throughout, not artificially calm, because the pilots would have heard the artificiality and it would have cost her their trust. Just genuinely focused. The kind of focus that leaves no room in the voice for fear because every available resource is being used for something else. 14 aircraft were clear. 15, 16. Mitchell's transponder track moved cleanly through the ridge clearance and into open airspace on the western side of the corridor. Mitchell, Emily said, you're clear. Good heading. How are your systems? A beat. Then Mitchell's voice and the relief in it was so unguarded that it was almost hard to listen to. Navigation is restoring. I'm reading clean. I'm clear. Another beat. Valkyrie, I'm clear. Yes, you are, Emily said. 17, 18, 19, and then Walker Sandstorm lead is clear. All aircraft confirmed status. 20 acknowledgements. All 20. Emily sat back in her chair. She realized her left hand had been gripping the edge of her workspace for the past 9 minutes. She looked at it and consciously relaxed it, and her fingers ached slightly from the sustained pressure. She put her hands flat on the desk and breathed. For approximately 10 seconds, she allowed herself to do nothing except breathe. Then she pulled the mission transcript she had been recording since 8:45 and began documenting. The frequency at the communications center was quiet for about 30 seconds after the last aircraft cleared. Then Walker came back. Carter. His voice had settled into something she had never heard from him before. Stripped of the command register. Just a man's voice talking to another person. Tell me what just happened. Emily looked at her monitors. She looked at the frequency map, where the DISA system signal was already beginning to decay, not because it had been defeated, but because its target had escaped. It had done exactly what it was designed to do. It had just failed to do it to the people it was designed to trap. An advanced electronic warfare system. Distributed electronic suppression architecture was positioned in the training corridor, she said. Multiple ground-based nodes calibrated to your operating frequencies, designed to activate when your formation entered the target zone and suppress navigation, communication, and warning systems simultaneously across all aircraft. How long have you known about it? I identified the signal 4 days ago. Silence. Hayes, she told us. 4 days ago, she came to the briefing room. More silence. Then Walker, and his voice had a quality in it that was very close to pain. The specific pain of a man who has just understood the full cost of a decision he made. Why didn't our sweeps catch it? Your sweeps weren't calibrated for the frequency range it operates on. I found it because I ran a manual recalibration outside standard parameters. Which is why, Emily said, and she kept her voice even without edge, because there was no satisfaction in this. Only the flat clarity of fact. Colonel Simmons told me to stay within standard protocol. The silence that followed lasted longer than the previous ones. Carter. Walker's voice came back. I owe you. He stopped. He started again. I need to say something to you. We have time for that when everyone is on the ground, Captain, Emily said. Right now, I need you to divert the formation to the secondary landing zone at Nellis. Do not return to the primary corridor. The system may still be active, and I want everyone clear of its effective radius until we can get a ground team in there. A pause, then Walker, and it was the first time in Emily's experience that he sounded uncertain about something. Is that your recommendation? Yes, Emily said, then we'll do it. He clicked off, then back on. Sandstorm formation, we are diverting to Nellis. Follow my lead. Carter, maintain monitoring and advise if anything changes. Copy, Emily said. She kept monitoring. And while she was monitoring, her left hand found the notebook on her desk, and she looked at the lines she had written 3 days ago. This is not a training exercise anymore. Underneath it, she wrote one more line, confirmed, but the moment did not last. It was not allowed to last because something was happening on the secondary monitor that had been quiet for the past several minutes. Something that should not have been happening. The DISA signal, which should have been decaying as the aircraft moved out of its operational radius, was not decaying. It was holding. Emily leaned forward. The signal was not tracking the formation. It was not following the aircraft. It was doing something she had not seen in any of the technical documentation. It was shifting not in intensity, but in direction. The nodes were reorienting, focusing on something that was not the formation, on something smaller, a single transponder signal. Emily's eyes went to the transponder overlay. Every aircraft in the formation was west of the corridor and moving toward Nellis, except one, Aircraft 17, Mitchell. She stared at the data. Her brain ran the numbers in the time it takes to draw a breath. Mitchell's gyro malfunction had not resolved. She had known that during the evacuation she had watched his track correct when she gave him headings, but the underlying fault had never cleared, which meant that when he exited the active suppression zone and his other systems began restoring his navigation, had done something specific and dangerous. It had restored to the last reliable position, fixed before the suppression activated. A position fix that was 3 minutes old. 8 F-16 speeds 3 minutes was roughly 35 miles. Mitchell's navigation was telling him he was 35 miles east of where he actually was. And the DISA system, which was not random, which was not natural interference, which had been placed by someone who understood exactly what they were doing, had identified the one aircraft that was still in range and still vulnerable. The nodes were focusing on him. Mitchell, Emily's voice went to a register that was not calm, that did not have room for calm, because calm was no longer what the situation called for. Mitchell, brake right now, hard. A half-second pause that felt like much longer. Then Mitchell, Valkyrie, my nav shows your nav is wrong. It's wrong by 35 miles. You are still inside the suppression radius. Brake right now, trust me. Silence. Emily watched the transponder track. For 1 second that lasted approximately forever, it did not move. Then it broke right. Hard and fast, the way a trained pilot moves when someone whose voice they trust tells them to move. And Emily watched the track sweep right across her monitor and felt something in her chest that was too large and too specific to be just relief. Good, she said, and her voice was steady again. Hold that heading. Do not deviate. She was already doing the math. He was clear of the focusing radius if he held. Mitchell, what are your systems showing now? Navigation is it's updating. I'm getting a new position fix. A pause. Valkyrie, my actual position is I was way east of where I thought. I know, you're correcting now. Keep that heading. Walker came back on the frequency. He had heard all of it. Carter, what just happened? The system tried for a second target, Emily said. Mitchell still had a nav fault. It identified him and refocused. She watched the track stabilize on the safe heading. He's clear now, but I need you to have him fly directly to Nellis under navigation advisement. Do not let him use independent navigation until his gyro fault is properly diagnosed on the ground. Understood. Walker's voice was clipped and absolutely focused. All the things that had complicated their relationship in the past 4 days were entirely absent. There was only the mission and the information she was giving him and his immediate complete use of it. Mitchell, you are under Valkyrie's navigation authority until you reach Nellis. Copy. Mitchell, and there was something in his voice now that was more than relief. Something quieter and more lasting. Copy Sandstorm lead. Valkyrie, I'm yours. Emily kept him on the frequency for the next 18 minutes. She called his heading corrections. She watched his track. She coordinated with Nellis Approach Control to ensure they had him as a priority arrival given his navigation status. She stayed on his frequency while the formation came in, while the other 19 aircraft landed one by one, while the mission that was supposed to be a training exercise gradually, specifically, completely became something else. When Mitchell's transponder showed final approach, Emily's hands finally stopped moving. She sat in the communications center at Edwards Air Force Base, alone in the blue-white glow of her monitors, and she listened to the sound of a landing she could not see and did not need to see because she could track it perfectly on her display, and because the sound of the approach controller's final calls told her everything she needed to know. Aircraft 17 Nellis Approach, you are cleared to land, runway 21 left. Welcome home. Mitchell's voice young and clear and coming from 30 miles away. Nellis Approach Aircraft 17, cleared to land, runway 21 left. And then after a moment, not on the official frequency, but on the channel she had been using for direct guidance, quiet and meant only for her Valkyrie. I'm down, thank you. Emily sat with that for a moment, just a moment, then she began writing the incident report, because this was not over. The DISA system had been in that corridor for at least a week. It had been calibrated to the squadron's specific operating frequencies. It had been activated at the exact moment the formation entered the target zone, and when the primary attack failed, it had refocused on the most vulnerable remaining aircraft. That last part was not in any technical paper she had read. That adaptive refocusing capability suggested a level of operational sophistication that changed the nature of the threat. It was not just a jamming system that someone had placed in a corridor to cause trouble. It was targeted, it was intelligent, and it had inside information. Emily wrote that down with the same precise systematic care she brought to everything. She documented the timeline, the signal data, the activation sequence, the adaptive behavior, and the specific operational knowledge that would have been required to configure the system with such precision. And then she sat back and looked at what she had written. And she thought about the one question that she had been holding at the edge of her mind for 4 days. The question she had not said aloud, because saying it aloud would have meant committing to a direction that she had not been certain she was ready to go. The question was simple. Who knew the mission schedule well enough to plan this? The answer was not simple, because the answer pointed somewhere inside Edwards Air Force Base. And Emily Carter, who had spent 6 years being invisible, was now the only person who understood this threat well enough to follow that question to wherever it led. She picked up her pen. She turned to a fresh page, and she began to write the second investigation, the one that started where the first one ended, and that would take her somewhere she had not been in a very long time, directly into the center of something dangerous. The incident report. Emily completed at 11:43 that morning was 14 pages long. It covered every signal reading, every timestamp, every communication exchange, from the moment she first detected the anomaly 4 days ago to the moment Mitchell's wheels touched the runway at Nellis. She documented everything with the systematic precision of someone who understood that this document would eventually be read by people with far more institutional authority than anyone currently on this base, and that every word needed to be exactly right. She printed 2 copies. She locked one in her station. The second she folded and put inside her jacket against her chest. Then she sat back and thought about the questions she had written at the top of the fresh page. Who knew enough to build this? The DISA system in that corridor had been calibrated with a level of operational specificity that required detailed knowledge of the 56th Fighter Squadron's mission parameters, not general knowledge of military F-16 operations. Specific knowledge. The nodes had been tuned to the exact frequency ranges the squadron used for navigation and primary communication. The activation timing had been precise, not a general window, but a window that corresponded exactly to when the formation would be deepest inside the corridor, farthest from any recovery option. That was not publicly available information. That was information that existed in one place, the mission planning documents for Operation Sandstorm. Emily had a list of everyone with access to those documents. She had compiled it over the past 4 days while running her signal analysis initially as background context, then, with increasing focus as the pieces began pointing in a direction she had not wanted to acknowledge. 14 people had full access to the complete mission planning package. 3 of those 14 were at the Joint Command Conference with Colonel Harrington and had been physically off base for the past week. That left 11. Of those 11, 4 had the technical background necessary to understand the operational value of what the mission documents contained, the specific data points that a DISA operator would need to calibrate their system. She looked at those 4 names. She looked at them for a long time. One of them she trusted without reservation. That was Kowalski, who was on the access list because maintenance coordination required it, and whose actions over the past 4 days had made his position clear beyond any possible doubt. None of them was Walker himself. Emily had spent 4 days studying Walker at close range, and what she had concluded was that he was a man whose flaws ran toward arrogance and rigidity rather than betrayal. The same certainty that had made him dismiss her warnings had also made him incapable of the kind of sustained deception that planning something like this required. You had to be able to hold 2 realities simultaneously to be a traitor, the performance and the truth underneath it. And Walker was a man who had never in his professional life believed there was any truth underneath his performance. That left 2, Captain Howard, the intelligence officer, who had listened to her for 20 minutes and then told her his hands were tied, and Lieutenant Colonel Patricia Simmons, who had taken her analysis papers, said she would pass them to technical review and effectively ended the conversation. Emily stared at those 2 names. She thought about Howard's expression when she had laid out her analysis, the careful, attentive listening that had felt genuine in the moment. She thought about the specific phrase he had used. "I believe your technical analysis is sound." He had believed her. He had said so, and then he had told her there was nothing he could do. She thought about Simmons telling her to stay within standard protocol parameters. She picked up her pen. She drew a slow, deliberate circle around one name. Then she stopped. She put the pen down. She needed more than instinct. Instinct was what had found the signal in the first place. And instinct had been right. But the next step required something harder and more specific. She needed evidence that would hold up to the kind of scrutiny that a betrayal allegation inside a military command structure would inevitably face. At 12:17, she called Kowalski. He picked up on the first ring. "Carter, I need you to do something for me," she said. "I need you to access the maintenance coordination logs from the past 30 days and find me every instance where the mission planning schedule for Sandstorm was shared outside standard distribution." A pause. "That's outside my clearance level." "I know." Another pause. "How outside?" he said. "About 2 levels." He was quiet for 4 seconds. "Give me 2 hours," he said. At 12:19, she walked to the intelligence office. Howard was at his desk when she came in. He looked up and something moved in his face. Not surprise, but a quality of recognition, as if he had been expecting her and was managing his response to seeing her earlier than anticipated. That small reaction told Emily something. She filed it without changing her expression. "Carter," he said, "I heard what happened out there. You should be proud of Captain Howard." She sat down across from him without being invited. "I need to ask you something directly, and I need you to answer me the same way." He looked at her carefully. "All right. The intelligence flag you said you were going to include in the pre-mission summary. I need to see the summary." His expression did not change. "That's a restricted document." "I know. I'm asking you to show it to me anyway." He studied her for a moment. "Why Milan?" "Because I need to know if my flag is actually in it." The silence that followed was 3 seconds long, which is a very long time when you are sitting across from someone and watching their face. Howard's expression went through something during those 3 seconds that Emily tracked with the full attention of someone who had spent the past 4 days learning to read signals that most people could not see. What she saw was not guilt. It was something more complicated than guilt. It was the expression of a man who was caught between two things he believed in and who had not yet decided which one he believed in more. Howard reached across his desk and unlocked a drawer. He pulled out a folder and set it on the desk between them, then turned it so she could read it. Emily looked at the pre-mission intelligence summary. She turned to the section where her frequency analysis flag should have appeared. It was there. She looked at it. She read it carefully. It was accurate, a concise, correctly attributed notation that a communications specialist had flagged unusual electromagnetic signatures in the training corridor and recommended further investigation. But it was listed under Priority Level 3. Emily looked up at Howard. Priority 3, she said. That's where I assessed it, he said. Priority 3 means it gets reviewed after the mission. It doesn't trigger any pre-flight action. She kept her voice level. You told me you'd flag it. I did flag it. You flagged it at a level that guaranteed nobody would act on it before the mission. Howard looked at her steadily. He did not immediately deny it, and that non-denial was its own kind of information. I assessed it at the level I felt was appropriate given the available evidence, he said. A communications specialist conducting unauthorized frequency analysis outside standard parameters is not typically the basis for a Priority 1 intelligence action. And if I had been an intelligence officer presenting the same data, he said nothing. Captain Howard, Emily leaned forward slightly. I'm going to ask you something else. And I want you to understand that I'm going to find the answer whether you tell me or not. I'm just giving you the option of telling me first. She paused. Did anyone talk to you about this mission before I came to your office? About the corridor? About the electronic environment? About anything related to the operational parameters of Sandstorm? Howard's jaw tightened slightly. Emily watched it tighten. This conversation, he said carefully, is moving into territory that I'm not comfortable with. Someone inside this base gave a hostile actor the information they needed to build a targeted EW attack against this squadron, Emily said. 20 pilots were just flying blind over Nevada because someone who had access to this mission's planning documents decided to use that access in a way that could have killed them. She held his gaze. If you know something and you stay quiet and someone dies next time, because there will be a next time, if we don't find who did this, that's on you. You understand me. Howard looked at her for a long time. The clock on his wall ticked through 8 seconds. Then he said very quietly, I received a communication 11 days ago from a source I had worked with previously in an analytical capacity. The communication suggested that the Squadron's Sandstorm mission represented a significant training opportunity to evaluate real-world EW resilience. The framing was it was framed as a sanctioned evaluation, a stress test. Emily felt the cold thing move through her again. Who was the source, she said. Howard looked at the window. I didn't know it was hostile, he said. I want to be clear about that. The framing was entirely consistent with the kind of interagency evaluation exercises we occasionally... Captain Howard, who was the source? He turned back to her. He said a name. Emily sat very still. It was not Simmons. It was a name she had not put on her list of 4 because it belonged to someone whose clearance level was above the direct mission access roster. Someone who had access to every mission document on the base, not because their name appeared on the distribution list, but because their position gave them standing access to all operational planning materials. Someone Emily had spoken to on the phone 6 days ago. Someone who had told her about the 4th vulnerability in the DISA system. Someone who had told her, you were always a pilot. Emily stood up. She was already moving before she fully processed the fact that she was moving. She walked to the door of Howard's office with the precise, contained momentum of someone who has just had the entire picture shift into focus and who now knows exactly what to do. Carter, Howard's voice came from behind her. Where are you going? She turned in the doorway. Stay here, she said. Don't call anyone. Don't communicate with that source. Don't do anything until I tell you. She looked at him directly. And Howard, I need you to ask yourself why the source that told you this was a sanctioned evaluation also happened to know the exact operational parameters of Sandstorm well enough to frame it that way. That's not a rhetorical question. I need you to actually think about it. She walked out. She was in the corridor moving fast when her phone rang. Kowalski. She picked up immediately. Talk to me, she said. I found something in the coordination logs, Kowalski said. His voice had the particular flatness of someone delivering information they don't like. 11 days ago, there was an access event on the Sandstorm planning documents. Not a standard access, it came through a remote terminal connection using a liaison credential. The credential belongs to the Interagency Coordination Office. Mercer, Emily said. Silence. How did you, Kowalski started. She told me about the fourth vulnerability, Emily said. She was still walking. She told me something that wasn't in any published paper. Something from a classified field evaluation. She turned the corner toward the base communications office. That information wasn't general knowledge. She wasn't sharing expertise with me, Dave. She was managing me. She was making sure I knew enough to save the pilots so that the mission failure didn't result in deaths, because deaths would trigger a completely different level of investigation. She needed the attack to happen, and she needed it to fail cleanly, and she needed me to be the one who made it fail. Why, Kowalski said. Emily pushed open the door to the base communications office. The duty officer looked up, startled. Because if I saved 20 pilots, it would make headlines, Emily said. And if it made headlines, it would look like exactly what it looks like, a communications technician who used to be a pilot heroically guiding a squadron through a crisis. It would draw attention away from the fact that a breach occurred and focus it on the human interest story instead. She sat down at the secure communications terminal and held out her hand for the duty officer's access card. She was using me as the cleanup operation. The duty officer looked at her outstretched hand and then at her face. Ma'am, I need authorization. I am Emily Carter, Communications Specialist, 56th Fighter Squadron, Emily said. I am reporting a security breach involving hostile access to mission planning documents and a coordinated electronic attack against 20 United States Air Force aircraft that took place this morning. I need this terminal in the next 30 seconds. The duty officer stared at her. Then he handed her the card. Emily activated the terminal and pulled up the secure reporting channel for Air Force Office of Special Investigations. Her hands moved across the keyboard with the same precision she brought to everything, fast, accurate, without unnecessary motion. Kowalski's voice was still in her ear. Emily, are you sure about this? Mercer is... I know who Mercer is, Emily said. I also know that the person who told me I was always a pilot was the same person who spent the past 11 days making sure I would be in exactly the right position to clean up the mess she created. She kept typing. That's the part that bothers me most, Dave. Not the betrayal, the precision of it. She knew me. She knew exactly what I would do. She knew you'd save them. She counted on it. Emily finished the initial report and authenticated it with her credentials. She added the incident timeline, the Howard conversation summary, the coordination log information Kowalski had found, and the specific detail of Mercer's disclosure of the classified fourth vulnerability, the detail that had felt like generosity at the time, and now read as something far more calculated. She submitted the report. The timestamp showed 13:14. She sat back from the terminal. The duty officer was still standing nearby, making no pretense of doing anything other than watching her. Thank you, she said to him. I'm going to need you to lock this terminal and hold all communications on this channel pending AFOSC response. Can you do that? Yes, ma'am, he said. He said it with the automatic compliance of someone who has just decided that whatever is happening is clearly well above their pay grade, and that the correct response to that situation is to do exactly what the person in front of them says. Emily's phone buzzed. Walker, she answered. Carter, his voice was back to its command register, but it was different now, tighter with a quality underneath it that she recognized as controlled urgency. I need you in the primary briefing room in 10 minutes. The formation is on the ground at Nellis, and I'm on a secure channel with Colonel Harrington. He wants a full brief on what happened in that corridor. I'll be there, Emily said. But Captain, I need you to hear something first. She told him, not everything, not the full Mercer thread, because that was AFOSC territory now, and she was not going to contaminate it with a chain of custody issue by spreading it before the investigators were engaged. But she told him enough. She told him that the attack was targeted and deliberate and based on inside information about the mission. She told him that she had filed an initial security breach report. She told him that someone with access to Sandstorm's planning documents had been complicit in what happened. Walker was quiet for a moment that felt much longer than it was. Someone here, he said. It was not a question. It was a man processing a thing that restructures the way you see everything around you. Someone with access, Emily said. I don't want to name a direction until AFOC is engaged and can conduct the investigation properly. But yes, she heard Walker breathe in once slow and deliberate. All right, he said. And then Carter, I need to say something to you. Captain, I need to say it. His voice was flat and direct and did not leave room for deflection. I dismissed you. I dismissed what you were telling me 4 days ago, and I dismissed it 3 times through 3 different channels, and I told you to stay in your lane. And this morning, 20 men flew into something that could have killed them because I was wrong and you were right. Emily said nothing. I'm going to say that to you directly face to face when we're in the same room, Walker continued. But I'm saying it now because it needs to be said before we walk into that briefing, and I don't want there to be any ambiguity about it. A pause. You saved them, all 20, including Mitchell, who... He stopped. He told me what you did. The heading calls, the terrain, the refocus event. Another pause. You saw everything I didn't see, and you were trying to tell me and I didn't listen. Emily sat in the communications office and felt the weight of those words settle over her. Not satisfaction, something more complicated than satisfaction. The particular ache of being right about something you desperately needed to be wrong about. I'll be at the briefing in 10 minutes, she said. She was there in 8. The room held Walker Howard, who had clearly walked over directly from his own office and looked like a man who had spent the intervening time making some decisions, and the secure video link to Colonel Harrington, who was appearing on a screen from 3 time zones away, with the focused intensity of a man who had just received an emergency brief and wanted more information as fast as possible. Harrington looked at Emily when she walked in. He did not say hello. He said, "You're Carter." "Yes, sir." "Walk me through it. From the beginning. Everything." Emily walked him through it. It took 22 minutes. She covered the signal detection, the analysis, the reporting attempts, the technical profile of the DISA system, the mission activation, the evacuation of the formation, Mitchell's secondary event, and the breach investigation. She covered it with a systematic, documented precision. She had been applying to everything since 4 days ago, and she answered every question Harrington asked, and he asked good questions, specific and technical, and coming from someone who actually understood what he was hearing with the same directness. When she finished, Harrington looked at her for a moment. "Carter," he said, "the coordination log access event you identified. Walk me through how you found that." Emily hesitated for exactly 1 second. "My maintenance coordination lead pulled the logs," she said, "under my direction, outside his clearance level." "Yes, sir." Harrington nodded once slowly with the expression of a man who is deciding whether to address something now or set it aside for later. He set it aside. "The name in the logs," he said, "your report identified the interagency liaison credential. You have a specific person." "I have a specific person," Emily said. "I've submitted the name in my AFOC report. I'd prefer to let that process run rather than make the allegation in open session." Harrington looked at Walker. Walker said nothing, which was Emily understood. Walker deferring to her judgment on this, something she would not have imagined possible 4 days ago, and that she did not currently have the bandwidth to fully absorb. "All right," Harrington said. "AFOC is being notified as we speak. I want a full base communication lockdown on Sandstorm-related materials, effective immediately. Nobody discusses the specifics of the corridor event outside secure channels." He looked directly at Emily. "Carter, I want you in that AFOC interview room at OH900 tomorrow. Primary witness, everything you know, everything you documented, everything in your reports." "Yes, sir." "One more thing." Harrington's expression changed slightly, not to warmth exactly, but to the kind of acknowledgement that a man in his position offers when he wants it understood that he sees something clearly. "I'm told you were an F-16 pilot." Emily felt the room shift slightly. "At one point, sir," she said, "I'm told you were one of the best this program ever produced." Emily said nothing. "The injury that ended your flight status," Harrington said, "has it been reviewed recently?" Emily looked at him. She looked at the screen, at the face of the man on it, and she understood that this question had a direction, and that the direction was one she had not allowed herself to look at in 6 years. "No, sir," she said. "It hasn't been reviewed." "I think," Harrington said, choosing his words with deliberate care, that given everything that has come to light about your capabilities in the past 24 hours, that review is overdue." He paused. "That's not a promise, and it's not an order. It's an observation." He looked at her steadily. "You understand me?" "Yes, sir," Emily said. "Good." He straightened in his chair. "Walker, I want the full formation status and the Nellis ground assessment on my desk in 2 hours. Carter, you're dismissed pending tomorrow's brief. Get some rest." He clicked off the screen. The room went quiet. Walker turned to Emily. They looked at each other across the table. Around them, Howard had found something on the floor to study, and the two other officers who had been present for the briefing were suddenly very occupied with their own materials. Walker and Emily looked at each other. "You kept your word," he said. "Everything you told me you could do, you did it." "I know what I can do," Emily said. Alou said, simply, without weight. Walker nodded. He looked like a man who was reorganizing something very fundamental and doing it in real time without a break to let the new structure settle before life required him to use it. "The pilots want to meet with you," he said. "Formally, when everyone is back on base." He paused. "Mitchell especially." Emily thought about Mitchell's voice on the frequency, the relief in it that had been so raw it was almost hard to hear. "I'd like that," she said. She walked out of the briefing room into the corridor. She walked down the corridor to the door and out of the building into the afternoon air. And she stood there for a moment with the sun coming down on her and the sounds of the base around her and the particular quality of stillness that exists after something large and necessary has been done. Her phone buzzed, a text from Kowalski. "You should come see the aircraft." Emily looked at the message. She looked at the sky. Then she typed back, "On my way," because there was something she needed to do. Something that had been waiting since Harrington asked his question, since Mercer's voice had said, "You were always a pilot," since the first morning she had walked into Hangar 7 and put her hand on the nose of an F-16D and felt the cold, specific truth of what it was and who she was and why she had never stopped coming back. She walked toward Hangar 7 with the same even pace she always used, the pace that gave nothing away to anyone watching. And inside her chest, something was moving that had been still for a very long time. The door was open when she arrived. Kowalski and Torres were standing beside the aircraft, not working, just standing with it the way people stand with something they have taken care of and are ready to hand back to the person it belongs to. Emily walked across the hangar floor. She stopped beside the cockpit. She put her hand on the frame. The metal was the same temperature it always was, real and specific and present. "Dave," she said. "Yeah." "Harrington is recommending a flight status review." Kowalski was quiet for a moment. "Then how do you feel about that?" Emily looked at the cockpit, at the seat, at the controls that her hands still knew from a life they had lived before this one. "I feel," she said slowly, "like I've been waiting 6 years to be asked that question." Torres made a sound that was not quite a laugh, but belonged to the same family. Kowalski put his hand on her shoulder briefly, just for a second. Then he stepped back. "Aircraft's ready," he said, "has been for 2 days." Emily stood with her hand on the frame of the cockpit and looked up through the open roof of the hangar at the rectangle of Nevada sky above them. The sky was waiting. It had always been waiting, and for the first time in 6 years, Emily Carter allowed herself to believe that she might be ready to meet it. The rest of that afternoon moved fast, the way time moves when the thing you have been bracing for has already happened and the world is still catching up to it. Emily spent 2 hours in the Base Communications Center completing her supplemental incident documentation. She was thorough in the way she was always thorough, methodical, precise, with no detail considered too small to record. The AFOC notification had gone through. Colonel Harrington's communication lockdown was in effect. The corridor was being marked as a restricted zone pending a ground investigation team that would be on site within 24 hours. The base had the particular quality of a place that knows something significant has occurred and is still deciding what shape that knowledge takes. Kowalski checked in at 1540. "The formation is wheels down at Nellis, all 20 aircraft accounted for. Mitchell's gyro fault has been flagged for full diagnostic. He's fine, a little shaken, but fine." He paused. "He's been asking about you." "I know," Emily said. "Walker told me." "What did you tell Walker?" "That I'd meet with the pilots when everyone is back on base." Kowalski was quiet for a moment. "And Mercer," Emily looked at the incident report on her screen. At the name she had typed carefully with the same precision she brought to everything, knowing exactly what that name would set in motion the moment the AFOC investigators read it. Patricia Mercer, retired colonel, former director of electronic warfare training, one of the 4 people alive who knew the full story of who Emily Carter actually was, who had used that knowledge as a tool. AFOC will handle Mercer, Emily said. It's not my job anymore. Does that feel strange? Kowalski said, handing it off. Emily thought about that honestly, the way she tried to think about difficult things without dressing it up into something cleaner than it actually was. Yes, she said. It feels strange. She paused. She was the one who told me I was always a pilot. 6 years ago, when she signed the separation papers, she looked me in the eye and said that a piece of paper didn't change who I was. She was quiet for a moment, and she was right. She just wasn't saying it to be kind. She was making an investment. An investment in what? In the fact that she would one day need someone who flew F-16s and was currently invisible. Someone who could solve a problem that she created and take all the attention for solving it while she watched from a distance. Emily closed the report. She knew me well enough to know I wouldn't stop. She knew I'd find the signal. She knew I'd fight to warn the squadron. She knew that when the mission went wrong, I'd find a way to bring those pilots home. She paused. She built the whole thing around what she knew about me. And she was wrong about one part of it, Kowalski said. Yes, Emily said. She was wrong about the part where I wouldn't look past the crisis to the source of it. She logged out of the terminal. I'm going to get some sleep, she said. I have an AFOC interview at 0900. Emily, his voice stopped her. For what it's worth, what you did today, not just the mission, all of it. The 4 days before it, the documentation, the analysis, the calls you made that nobody wanted to hear. He paused. That's the most complete thing I've ever seen one person do. Emily stood with the phone against her ear for a moment. Thank you, Dave, she said. She meant it, completely. She went to her corridor, set her alarm for 0600, lay down on her bunk, and was asleep within 4 minutes. She did not dream about the corridor. She did not dream about the DISA signal or the 20 transponder tracks or Mitchell's voice on the frequency. She slept the way people sleep when they have done what they were supposed to do, which is the deepest and most uncomplicated kind of sleep there is. At 0600, her alarm brought her back. She was at the AFOC interview room by 0850. The 2 investigators were already there, a special agent named Reyes and her partner, a quiet man named Durkin, who took notes with a mechanical pencil and had the particular talent of looking like he wasn't paying close attention while demonstrating through his questions that he had absorbed every word. They interviewed Emily for 3 hours and 14 minutes. She told them everything: the signal detection, the analysis, the reporting attempts, Howard's disclosure, and what it revealed about the communication he had received from Mercer, the coordination log access event that Kowalski had identified, the 4th vulnerability disclosure and what it meant about Mercer's role, the adaptive refocusing event that had targeted Mitchell after the main formation escaped, which Emily explained, required real-time monitoring of the mission from someone with access to the transponder data, and that access had come through the same interagency liaison credential that had accessed the mission planning documents. Mercer had not just planned the attack. She had been watching it. She had been watching Emily run the counter-operation in real time. And when the main formation escaped, she had watched the system refocus on Mitchell, and she had done nothing. Because Mitchell's loss would have been manageable. A training accident, equipment failure, investigations that might eventually point toward the corridor, but would lack the specific technical knowledge to understand what had actually happened there. Reyes looked at Emily when she said that part. You're saying she was willing to let Mitchell go down, Reyes said. She needed the attack to appear inconclusive, Emily said. A clean escape by the full formation with documented evidence of a DISA system and a communications specialist who clearly understood its architecture. That's a very clean chain of evidence pointing straight back to the breach. One accident, one equipment failure, much murkier picture. But you pulled Mitchell out, Durkin said without looking up from his notes. I pulled Mitchell out, Emily confirmed. Durkin wrote something. Reyes looked at Emily steadily. You knew Mercer personally. Yes. She was important to your career. She was my commanding officer at one point. She signed my deployment papers. She signed my separation papers. Emily looked at her hands on the table and then back at Reyes. She told me I was always a pilot. I believe she meant it as kindness. She paused. I was wrong about her motives. I wasn't wrong about the statement. Rhea studied her for a moment. How did that feel, realizing what she'd done? Emily thought about the honest answer. Like something I didn't have time for, she said. There were 20 pilots in a compromised airspace. The feelings were going to have to wait. She paused. They're still waiting. Reyes nodded. She made a note. At 12:22, the interview concluded. Emily signed her statement, authenticated the attached documentation, and walked out into the corridor. Walker was waiting outside the door. Howe was standing with his hands at his sides and his posture straight, the way he always stood, but there was something different in his face that Emily had not seen before. Not in 4 days of watching him, not through 2 briefings and a mission disaster and everything that had followed. It was a quality she associated with people who had been required to reckon with something large and had come out the other side of the reckoning without looking away from what they found. Interview done, he said. Yes. Formation lands back at Edwards at 1400, he said. All 20, I want you on the flight line. Emily looked at him. That's not a command, he said. It's a request. She held his gaze for a moment. I'll be there, she said. At 13:58, Emily was standing on the flight line at Edwards Air Force Base when the first F-16 appeared on approach. She was not standing at the front. That had not been a deliberate choice. She had simply positioned herself where she had a clear view of the runway and the approach path, which put her slightly to the side of the group of ground personnel and junior officers who had gathered for the formation's return. She was wearing her standard uniform. Her hands were in her pockets. She looked exactly the same as she always looked. The first aircraft touched down. Then the second, the third, the sequence of them one after another, the specific ground-shaking arrival of each F-16 coming home. And Emily stood and watched all of it with the full attention of someone who understood exactly what she was watching and why it mattered. 18, 19, 20, all 20. She let out a breath she had been holding, she realized, since 8:45 that morning. The aircraft taxied in, and the canopies came up, and the pilots began climbing down, and the ground crew moved forward with the practiced efficiency of people who knew their jobs. And for a few minutes, it was the controlled, organized business of an operation completing successfully. And then it wasn't. Because Mitchell was the 4th pilot to reach the ground, and he was still wearing his flight gear, and his helmet was under his arm, and he was 24 years old, and he walked directly without any hesitation to Emily Carter. He did not say anything for a moment. He stood in front of her and looked at her, and his jaw was working slightly the way jaws do when people are trying to find the right words for something that does not have standard words. You kept me off that ridge, he said. Yes, Emily said. I didn't know where I was, he said. My nav was wrong and I couldn't trust any of it, and I was handling it. I want you to know that I was trying to handle it, but I didn't actually know how close. 1,100 feet, Emily said gently. You had 1,100 feet, it was manageable. Mitchell looked at her. His face said very clearly that he understood the gap between 1,100 feet and the alternative, and that he was doing the math on what that gap meant, and that the math was not comfortable. I heard your voice, he said, and I knew you could see what I couldn't see. That was, he stopped. He started again. I've been flying for 4 years. I've never had to trust someone completely like that. No instruments, no visual, just a voice. He looked at her. How did you know I'd listen? Emily thought about that. I didn't know, she said. I hoped you were the kind of pilot who would. Something moved in his face. Young and real and unguarded, in the way that only happens when people are too recently past something frightening to have built the performance back up yet. Thank you, he said. Not the formal controlled thanks of the military context, the other kind. The kind that comes from the body, from the part of a person that knows it is still alive and is trying to say something about that. You're welcome, Mitchell, Emily said. He stepped back. He started to turn, and then he stopped. Can I ask you something? Sure. Walker told us what you told him, about who you were before. He paused. Valkyrie. Emily said nothing. Why did you stop? He said it with the direct simplicity of someone young enough to ask the question that older people have learned not to ask. If you were that good, why did you stay behind a desk for 6 years? Emily looked at him for a moment. I didn't stop, she said. I stayed close. She paused. Sometimes that's what the job looks like. Mitchell held her gaze for a moment. Then he nodded once with the particular quality of someone filing something away that they don't fully understand yet, but know they will need later. He walked back toward the group. The rest of the pilots came to her in ones and twos over the next 20 minutes. Hayes was the one who surprised her most. He came with his hands in his jacket pockets and stopped a few feet away and looked at her with the straightforward discomfort of someone who was holding something they should have put down sooner. "Radio girl," he said. Emily looked at him. "I said that," he said. "I started that. I want you to know that I know that, and I know what it meant, and that's not something I can take back. I just need to say that I know it." "Hayes," Emily said. He looked at her. "I know you know it," she said. "That's enough." He nodded. He extended his hand. She shook it. And then Walker was there. The pilots had cleared a space around them without being asked, to the way people make space for something they understand is necessary without needing it explained. Walker stood in front of Emily, and his afternoon sun was behind him, and she could see the full weight of the past 4 days on his face, not breaking him. Walker was not a man who broke easily, but not absent either. Present and accounted for and being carried honestly. "I said I'd do this face to face," he said. "Captain, let me finish." His voice was level and direct, and she had the sense that he had prepared this not in the sense of rehearsing words, but in the sense of a man who had spent the previous night being honest with himself and had come out of it knowing exactly what he needed to say. "I made a judgment about you that had nothing to do with your competence and everything to do with where you were standing in the room. I dismissed what you were telling me because of who I thought you were, not because of what you were actually saying. And I was wrong, not close to right, completely wrong." Emily held his gaze. "You went through every legitimate channel," he continued, 3 times. "You documented everything. You were professional and precise, and you never once—" He stopped. He steadied. "You never once acted like I deserved less than your best effort, even after I made it clear I wasn't going to listen. And that says something about you that I don't have the right words for right now." He paused. "I'm sorry, Carter, for what I said in that briefing room, for what I said in the corridor, for 4 days of making you invisible when you were the most important person on this base." The flight line was quiet enough that Emily could hear the distant sound of engines taxing the normal background noise of a base returning to its regular rhythm. "Captain Walker," Emily said. She kept her voice even, not because she needed to protect herself, but because she was telling him something true, and she wanted it to land clearly. "You were wrong about me, but you weren't wrong about the process. The process exists for good reasons. What was wrong was that the process couldn't see past its own assumptions, and the person trying to make it see was standing in a position the process had already decided didn't matter." She paused. "That's not just your failure. That's a structural problem. And fixing it means looking at more than one person's behavior." Walker absorbed that. "You're right," he said. "I usually am," Emily said. And she said it with just enough of a specific contained dryness that Walker registered it, and something in his face shifted into something that was not quite a smile but belonged to the same territory. "Yeah," he said. "I'm starting to understand that." He extended his hand. She shook it. And that was the moment, not the guidance calls or the incident report or the AFOSI interview, but this specific moment on the flight line at Edwards with the sun moving west and 20 pilots standing in a loose group, and Walker's hand in hers, that Emily Carter felt something she had not felt in 6 years, not vindication, something quieter than vindication. Recognition, the simple specific experience of being seen as what you actually are. She did not let herself stay in it too long. There was still work to do. At 15:30, Harrington called Walker's secure line and asked to speak with Emily directly. She took the phone. "AFOSI has confirmed the warrant for Mercer's records," Harrington said. "The coordination log access event is corroborated by 2 additional data points they found in the Interagency Communications Archive. The case is solid." He paused. "She's been contacted. She knows an investigation is active." Emily thought about Mercer sitting somewhere reading an alert notification, understanding that the operation she had built so carefully around Emily's predictable competence had turned in the one direction she had not planned for. "How is she responding?" Emily said. "She's retained counsel," Harrington said, "which tells us what we need to know about her response." A pause. "Carter, the flight status review I mentioned. I've spoken with the medical board. Given that your original grounding was based on an injury assessment that was conducted under time pressure and not subsequently revisited, they are prepared to conduct a current evaluation at your request." That's not a guarantee of any particular outcome. But the door is open if you want to walk through it. Emily stood with the phone against her ear and the afternoon light on her face. I'd like to request the evaluation, sir, she said. Goodwin Harrington said, I'll have the medical board coordinator contact you this week. A pause. One more thing. Your technical analysis of the DISA system, the full operational profile you built, including the fourth vulnerability data, and the adaptive refocusing behavior you documented during the mission. I want that turned into a formal training document, something that goes into the curriculum for every EW training program in the Air Force. Emily blinked. Sir, you identified something about that system that nobody else had documented in operational terms, Harrington said. The adaptive refocusing. We didn't know it could do that. We didn't know how to counter it. You figured that out under live conditions with 20 aircraft in distress. That knowledge belongs in the training program. A pause. I'm assigning you as lead author on the technical document. You'll work with the EW training office directly. That's not optional. Emily looked at the phone for a moment. Understood, sir, she said. Well done, Carter, Harrington said with the specific simplicity of a man who chooses his words carefully enough that simple ones carry full weight. Very well done. The call ended. Emily stood still for a moment. Then she walked to find Kowalski. He was in Hangar 7. He was not working on the aircraft. He was standing beside it with Torres, and they were having a conversation that Emily could see from the door had the comfortable, directionless quality of two people who have nothing specific to do and are all right with that. She walked in. They both turned. She looked at the aircraft. Then she looked at both of them. Fosse has the cases, she said. Harrington is recommending the flight status review, and he wants me to write the DISA training document for the Air Force curriculum. Torres whistled softly. Kowalski looked at her with the particular expression she had come to understand over 4 years, was his version of being very moved, controlled, quiet, but present in his eyes. So what does that mean for you, he said. Emily looked at the F-16D. She thought about the first time she had put her hand on the nose of an aircraft like this one at age 22, before her first solo flight, when the enormity of what she was about to do had made her stand very still for a moment and feel the full specific weight of it. She thought about what it felt like to be at altitude, where everything below is abstracted into shape and pattern, and the sky above is the only unlimited thing left. She thought about the 7 years she had spent in a cockpit and the 6 years she had spent without one, and she thought about the fact that both of those periods had made her exactly who she was in ways she could not have separated from each other, even if she had wanted to. It means, she said slowly, that I might fly again. Torres looked at Kowalski. Kowalski looked at Emily. And the writing, Torres said, the training document. That matters too, Emily said. Maybe more than the flying. She paused. There are pilots out there right now who don't know what I know about that system. There are 20 men who almost died today because that knowledge didn't exist in the right place at the right time. If I can put it where it needs to be, she looked at the aircraft. That's not a small thing. No, Kowalski said, it isn't. The three of them stood in the hangar with the F-16D between them, and the quiet of the place settled around them the way quiet settles in spaces where something has been decided. There's something I need to ask you both, Emily said. They looked at her. The aircraft, she said, the unauthorized maintenance, the off-hours work. If anyone pulls the logs from this hangar, there's going to be a record of what we did here. I filed my incident report and named myself and my analysis in it. I didn't name either of you in the hangar operations because that wasn't relevant to the AFOC investigation. She looked at both of them. But I want you to know that if it comes up, I'll be clear that everything done to that aircraft was done with my knowledge and under my direction. Torres shook his head immediately. That's not, Torres. Emily's voice was firm, but not hard. You came here on your own time after retirement because Dave called you and asked for help. You have no obligation to carry any consequence from this. Emily, Torres said. He said it with the uncomplicated directness of a man who had been around long enough to be past the stage where people dress up their intentions in careful language. I was here because I wanted to be here, not because Dave asked, because you were doing something that mattered and you needed a hand. That's the whole story. He shrugged. If someone wants to have a problem with that, they can get in line. Kowalski said nothing. He just looked at Emily with the steady, unhurried expression that was simply who he was. All right, Emily said. She turned back to the aircraft one more time. She put her hand on the frame of the cockpit. The metal was the same temperature it always was. Dave, she said, yeah, thank you. She said it to the aircraft and to him simultaneously because they had become over 6 years of early mornings and quiet maintenance checks in the particular intimacy of two people keeping a shared secret, something that could not be entirely separated. For all of it, every hour you put into this, every time you didn't ask me why. Kowalski put his hand briefly on her shoulder. You'd have gotten here one way or another, he said. I just helped keep the aircraft ready. The next 3 days were the fastest Emily had moved through any period in recent memory, and her recent memory included guiding 20 aircraft through an electronic warfare event while simultaneously identifying a security breach and building an investigative case that had led to an arrest warrant. The fussy investigation moved with the particular focused efficiency of an organization that had been given clear evidence and institutional authority to follow it. Mercer's records were secured. The interagency communications were preserved and analyzed. The coordination log access event was corroborated by digital forensics. The ground team that entered the Nevada corridor found 7 decinodes buried at intervals across the terrain, each one small enough to have been missed by a standard visual sweep, each one precisely calibrated to the 56th Fighter Squadron's operating frequencies. When the lead investigator showed Emily the photographs of the recovered nodes, she sat with them for a moment and thought about the 7 days she had spent watching the signal grow on her monitor, the careful, methodical way the system had been built, and calibrated the sophistication of someone who understood both the technology and the specific operational environment they were targeting. She knew our frequencies, Emily said. She had access to the technical specifications as part of her liaison role, Reyes confirmed. We found them in the access records. Emily nodded. She thought about Mercer telling her about the 4th vulnerability, giving her exactly enough to succeed to save the pilots cleanly, to make the attack appear to fail without generating the specific forensic evidence that a total disaster would have produced, a calibrated outcome, managed from a distance by someone who knew that Emily would run exactly the counter-operation she ran, and who had assumed that Emily would stop when the immediate crisis was resolved. What Mercer had miscalculated was the thing she had also identified clearly. Emily Carter did not stop. She had not stopped in 4 days of being dismissed and overruled and sent back to her desk. She had not stopped when Walker told her to stay in her lane. She had not stopped when Simmons redirected her to technical review. She had not stopped when the mission launched into the corridor she had been warning about for days. She had not stopped when the crisis was resolved because the crisis resolving was not the same thing as the problem being solved. Mercer had known the pilot. She had not fully known the person. On the 4th day after the mission, Emily sat in a conference room in the medical evaluation wing and answered questions from 2 flight surgeons who were systematic and thorough and occasionally asked her to wait while they reviewed records that were 6 years old and still classified at a level that required additional authorization to access. She answered every question honestly. She described the original injury in clinical terms and in experiential terms because the flight surgeons asked for both. She described what she had done with her body and her reaction times and her situational awareness in the past 4 days because they asked for that too. She sat in the evaluation chair and ran through the physical and cognitive assessment battery that was standard for flight status reviews. And she did not think about passing or failing because thinking about it would not change the results, and she had never in her professional life found productive use for energy spent on outcomes she couldn't control. What she could control was being honest about what she knew about herself. And what she knew was this, that she was the same person who had flown combat missions at 26. The injury had taken something physical, and she had rebuilt it over 6 years quietly without anyone watching. The 6 years at the communication station had not diminished her. They had added to her. She understood things now about aircraft and pilots and the gap between instruments and reality that she had not understood from inside the cockpit. Because you cannot fully understand what a pilot needs from the ground until you have been the person providing it. She was more than she had been, not despite the 6 years, because of them. The lead flight surgeon looked up from the final assessment form and looked at Emily across the table. Carter, he said, I want to be direct with you. Please, Emily said. Your physical assessment is within flight-ready parameters. The original injury has healed to a degree that the initial assessment did not project, and there is nothing in your current physical profile that represents a disqualifying condition." He paused. "Cognitively and situationally, frankly, your performance indicators during the Sandstorm event represent some of the most impressive real-time situational awareness documentation I've seen in a review file." Emily looked at him steadily. "Your flight status can be restored," he said, "pending a standard requalification program, which given your background would likely be abbreviated. But I want to ask you one question before I finalize this." "All right. Why do you want to fly again?" he said, and not the official answer, the real one. Emily was quiet for a moment. The real answer was not a single thing. It was layered the way all real answers are layered, and some of the layers were not comfortable to look at. There was the part that was simply who she was, the pilot's certainty that the sky was her natural element, that she was more herself at altitude than anywhere else, that some people simply belong in certain places, and she had always belonged there. There was the part that was unfinished business, the long ache of a career interrupted rather than completed, the sense of something set down that was always supposed to be picked back up. But underneath those layers was the one that mattered most. "Because I'm better at everything else when I can fly," she said. "The analysis, the guidance, the training document, I'm going to write about the DISA system, all of it. I understand it differently from up there." She paused. "And because I spent 6 years proving that you can contribute from the ground, from the background, from the place where nobody is looking. I proved it completely. I don't need to prove it anymore." She held the flight surgeon's gaze. "I'm ready to be where I can be seen." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he picked up his pen and signed the assessment form. On the morning that the 56th Fighter Squadron gathered in the primary briefing room for the first full formation meeting since Operation Sandstorm, Emily Carter walked in through the door, and every person in that room was already standing. Not at attention, not in the formal military posture of a commanded formation. Just stand the way people stand when something arrives that they feel the need to be upright for. She looked at them, all 20 pilots plus Kowalski in the back row, plus Torres beside him, plus Howard in the corner, with the specific expression of a man who was doing the ongoing work of understanding what his own role in this had been and what it required of him going forward. Walker was at the front. He did not say anything elaborate. He said, "For the record, Emily Carter, Communications Specialist, 6th Fighter Squadron, Edwards Air Force Base. Flight status restoration approved." He paused. "And the best damn officer in this building." Nobody laughed. Nobody called her radio girl. Mitchell started it. He brought his hands together once, and then Hayes joined him, and then the room was full of it. Not the polite formal applause of ceremony, but the real kind, the kind that comes from people who mean it because they are alive and they know why. Emily stood in the front of the room and felt it. She did not deflect it. She did not minimize it. She had spent 6 years being invisible, and she had done extraordinary work while invisible, and that had been necessary, and she did not regret it. But she was done being invisible now. She looked at the room full of people who were alive because she had refused to stop, who were standing and making noise in her direction because they understood what that refusal had cost and what it had produced. She let herself feel it, fully, without protection. Walker extended his hand again, and this time when she took it, he covered it with his other hand. Briefly, a small, unplanned gesture, the kind that happens when a person's body says something their words have not found yet. "Where do you want to start?" he said. Emily looked at him. She thought about the DISA training document waiting to be written, the requalification program that would put her back in a cockpit, the investigation that was moving forward with or without her daily involvement, the fourth vulnerability that was not in any published paper, the adaptive refocusing behavior that 20 pilots now knew about, because she had lived through it with them, and they would carry that knowledge into every mission they flew for the rest of their careers. She thought about Mercer, who had known her well enough to build an operation around her and had still underestimated the most essential thing, that Emily Carter did not stay where she was put. That the same stubbornness that had kept her at her desk at 4 a.m, running unauthorized recalibrations, was the same stubbornness that had looked at a 14-page incident report and kept going and would always keep going because that was simply the nature of who she was. She thought about the F-16D in Hangar 7. She thought about the With the training documents, she said, we start there because the next squadron that flies into something like that corridor needs to already know what we know. She paused, and then we fly. Walker nodded. Then we fly, he agreed. Emily Carter had spent 6 years in the background of a world that had decided it already knew everything it needed to know about her. She had spent 6 years being the woman nobody noticed doing work that kept people alive without anyone understanding why they had stayed alive. Maintaining an aircraft that nobody knew she was maintaining, carrying a call sign that nobody on this base had heard. She had done all of that without bitterness and without performance, because the work was the work and it mattered regardless of who was watching. But she had also spent 6 years waiting for the moment when the work would require her to be fully herself, not the invisible version, not the background version, not the version that stayed in her lane and accepted the frame that other people built around her. That moment had come. And Emily Carter, Valkyrie pilot analyst, the woman who had saved 20 men and unraveled the operation designed to use her, stood in the front of the room where people had once walked past her without seeing her, and she was seen now completely by every person present. The last hope of the squadron had been the woman nobody noticed, and the legend had not returned. She had never left.